So picture this scene in your mind. It's August 18th, 2020. You're standing on the deck of the USS Mustin.
Right, the guided missile destroyer.
Exactly, a massive United States Navy destroyer. And it's slipping quietly into the northern end of the Taiwan Strait. It's a completely solo mission.
It's just steaming right down the middle.
Yeah, and the warship's 5-inch gun is pointed deliberately southward. There's this stiff, salty, southwestern breeze whipping across the gray steel deck.
Setting the scene. I like it.
Well, the sources describe it so vividly. Above you, there are these high, fast-moving clouds casting long, dark shadows on the water. And if you look to the west, those shadows stretch all the way toward the mainland.
Right, toward the great port cities of China.
Exactly, places like Xiamen, bustling, neon-lit cities. But if you turn and look to the east, rising out of the mist, you see the tall, cloud-hidden peaks of Taiwan.
It's a wildly cinematic image, but I mean, the reality inside that ship is actually even more intense than the view from the deck.
Oh, absolutely.
Because inside the Combat Information Center, you have rows of sailors sitting in these dark, air-conditioned rooms.
Bathed in the glow of tactical screens, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they are tracking an unbelievable amount of data. I mean, they're watching Chinese fighter jets, surveillance drones, civilian fishing militias.
Even military satellites, according to the documents.
Right. All moving across the Indo-Pacific in real time. Up on the bridge, the massive radar is feeding this constant stream of telemetry right into the ship's targeting computers.
And down on the deck, you've got 96 vertical launch cells just sitting there, heavily armed.
It's a very loud, very physical projection of American military power. But, here is the incredible contrast that our sources for this deep dive highlight today.
This is the part that really blew my mind.
Right. Because as the USS Mustin sails through that strait, sending this unmistakable message, the leaders in Beijing weren't actually panicking over the warship.
Not at all.
No, they were agonizing over something completely invisible.
Yeah, while the Navy was doing freedom of navigation patrols, the real devastating blow was actually being dealt by a completely obscure piece of bureaucracy.
From the U.S. Commerce Department, of all places.
Right. It's this regulation called the Entity List. And at that exact moment in 2020, Washington was weaponizing it to systematically cut off China's crown jewel tech giant.
Huawei.
Yeah, Huawei, cutting them off from accessing advanced computer chips.
Cool, let's unpack this because I want to make sure we actually understand the mechanics here.
It's crucial to understand it.
Because it sounds like a standard news headline, but the reality is staggering. How does a piece of paper in Washington physically stop a Chinese company from getting a microchip that, isn't even made in America?
Well, it works like a legal contagion, really.
Yeah.
The U.S. government essentially decreed that any company in the world, whether they're in Japan or the Netherlands or Taiwan,
basically anywhere,
if they use American software or American testing equipment to design or manufacture a computer chip, they are legally barred from selling that chip to Huawei.
Wow. So because American intellectual property is baked into almost every stage of the global semiconductor supply chain,
Washington could just reach across the planet and dictate who gets the hardware of the future.
that is wild.
It was, as the analysts in our sources call it, technological asphyxiation. And I mean, it worked. Huawei's smartphone business completely plummeted.
And that contrast, right? A heavily armed, multi-billion-dollar destroyer in the water and a microscopic piece of silicon dictating the rise and fall of global superpowers.
It perfectly captures the complexity of the region.
It's exactly why we are here today. We are taking a deep dive into a towering stack of sources. We've got historical analyses, declassified military strategy documents,
Geopolitical frameworks, economic breakdowns.
all of it. And our mission is to answer one massive, terrifying question for you today. How did a small island of 23 million people become the most dangerous flashpoint on Earth?
And I think the first step to answering that is sort of discarding the way we usually look at maps.
What do you mean?
Well, we have this tendency to view Taiwan as just a piece of geography, just a rock in the ocean. But Taiwan is not merely an island.
Right.
It is the exact geographic, economic, and psychological point where history, identity, technology, and military power violently converge.
You can't separate them.
No, you can't separate the microchips from the deep history, and you can't separate the military warships from the psychology of the people who actually live there.
Which brings us to a massive misconception we need to dismantle right out of the gate.
The breakaway province narrative.
Yes. If you watch the news, the phrasing you hear constantly is breakaway province.
Like it's a rebellious state.
Right. The narrative implies that Taiwan is this cleanly broken piece of a Chinese ceramic plate, and the current tension is just an argument over when to glue it back on.
But our historical sources paint a completely different picture of what Taiwan actually is.
It's not a broken plate at all.
No, that narrative is entirely historically inaccurate. To truly understand Taiwan, you have to look at it as a geological core sample.
A core sample, yeah. I love that analogy.
Because if you drill down into the bedrock of Taiwanese history, you don't find a monolithic Chinese identity. You find deep, distinct, and incredibly complex layers.
And the very bottom layer, the absolute foundation of the island, has literally nothing to do with China.
Nothing at all.
We're talking about the Austronesian indigenous peoples, and this blew my mind. Before any Han Chinese settlers ever arrived, Taiwan was home to dozens of distinct, vibrant indigenous tribes.
The Atayal, the Amis, the Paiwan, the Soraya.
Yeah, and they had been there for thousands of years. They were incredible navigators, agriculturalists.
Their relationship with the land was entirely different from the empires that would eventually show up to try and exploit it.
For most of its recorded history, Taiwan wasn't a province of anyone.
It was an island of attempted and honestly often failed conquest.
There is this captivating detail in the sources regarding the oral history of the Atayal tribe.
Oh, the migration story.
Yes. It describes their ancestors migrating over generations. The myth says they emerged from a sacred, shattered stone high up in the dense mountain ranges of the island.
Right, deep in the interior.
And they moved slowly, century by century, pushing east through the deep forests. And the oral history vividly describes the moment they finally reached the coast and saw the ocean for the very first time.
It's amazing.
It describes them blinking at the bright, blinding reflection of the sun on the water. It's such a beautiful, visceral image.
It really is.
It roots the Taiwanese story not in a political treaty in Beijing, but in a prehistoric migration through mountain forests.
That deep root is essential. Because, the first Chinese records of Taiwan actually date back to 230 AD, during the Three Kingdoms period.
Okay, so a long time ago.
Yeah, an expedition arrived, found it full of these indigenous tribes, deemed it barbarian territory, and basically decided it wasn't worth the investment in blood and treasure to try and conquer it.
They just walked away.
Pretty much. It was considered wild, untamed, and frankly, completely irrelevant to the imperial center.
So the Chinese Empire ignores it for over a millennium. When does the next layer of that core sample get laid down?
That would be the 1600s.
Yeah.
The era of European colonial expansion.
The Dutch.
Right. The Dutch East India Company, which was essentially the most powerful multinational corporation in the world at the time, was looking for strategic outposts for their trade ships.
And they chose Taiwan?
Yeah. In 1624, they established a colony on the southwestern coast of the island. They named it Isla Formosa.
The beautiful island. But the duck layer is actually incredibly thin, right? They didn't hold it for long.
No, they barely lasted 4 decades. And the way they were forced, it sounds like something straight out of a Hollywood script.
It really does.
In 1661, they were besieged and ousted by a massive fleet led by a pirate prince named Coxinga.
I had to read that section of the sources twice. A pirate prince.
A literal pirate prince. He was a fascinating historical figure. Coxinga was a Ming dynasty loyalist.
Okay, so the Ming had just been overthrown by the invading Qing dynasty on the mainland.
Exactly. So Coxinga fled, took his massive fleet of pirates, merchants, and loyalist soldiers, kicked the Dutch out of Taiwan, and established his own independent kingdom there.
Just set up his own base.
Yeah, as a staging ground to eventually try and retake the mainland.
So Taiwan is now a rogue pirate kingdom. How does the Qing dynasty, the new rulers of mainland China, react to this?
Well,
because modern Beijing claims that Taiwan has been an inalienable part of China since ancient times, I imagine the king must have marched right in and integrated it into the empire.
They did eventually annex it.
In
1683, after Coxinga's grandson finally surrendered.
Okay.
But the critical revelation in our sources is that the Qing dynasty barely cared about the island once they had it.
Wait, really?
Yeah, there is this enduring modern myth that Taiwan was always a highly valued, integral part of the Chinese motherland. The historical record shows the exact opposite.
Profound imperial apathy.
Profound apathy.
The sources are so explicit on this point. I was stunned to read that the Qing dynasty actually offered to sell Taiwan back to the Dutch after they conquered it.
They absolutely did. They viewed it as a massive headache.
A headache.
To the Qing court in Beijing, Taiwan was a miserable, malaria-infested frontier full of hostile indigenous tribes, and rebellious Chinese pirates. It was a massive drain on the imperial treasury.
I want to dig into how they actually governed it because it completely shatters the integral province idea. You read that the king only managed to loosely control the western flatlands where some Chinese farmers had settled.
Right, just the coast.
But the eastern two-thirds of the island, the rugged mountains, they completely gave up on it.
They literally drew a physical boundary. It was called the Earth Ox Line, or the Red Line on imperial maps.
The Earth Ox Line.
Yeah. They dug trenches and built earthworks to physically separate the Chinese settlers on the west coast from what they officially designated as the raw savages of the mountainous interior. The king-emperor explicitly decreed that anything that happened past that red line was not the responsibility of the Chinese government.
So they just disavowed two-thirds of the island's landmass.
Completely.
Think about the mechanics of that. An empire actively building a wall to keep its own supposed territory out.
It's wild.
Yeah.
And they didn't even make Taiwan a proper Chinese province until 1887.
Right. Before that, for 200 years, it was just a loose, poorly managed prefecture of Fujian province across the strait.
And it was managed entirely as an extractive colony.
What does that mean for the people living there?
Well, in 2 centuries of king rule, there is no historical record of a single native-born Taiwanese civil servant ever passing the imperial exams and serving in the local government.
Not one.
Not one. The officials were entirely mainlanders who rotated in, extracted whatever wealth they could through taxes and corruption, and then rotated out.
It must have bred immense resentment among the local population.
Oh, massive resentment. There's a popular saying during the King era, every 3 years an uprising, every 5 years a rebellion.
Okay, so we have the Austronesian base, the brief Dutch lair, the pirate kingdom lair, and the highly apathetic, corrupt king imperial lair.
Right.
But then we hit 1895. And this is a massive, violent geological shift in our core sample.
1895 is the defining turning point for modern Taiwanese identity.
What happens?
The Qing dynasty fights the First Sino-Japanese War against a rapidly industrializing Japan. The Qing suffer a humiliating defeat.
And as part of the peace treaty, they cede Taiwan to Japan.
Yes, not as a temporary lease, but in perpetuity. The island is literally signed away forever.
And the Japanese rule for 50 years, right up until the end of World War II.
Correct.
How did that period reshape the island? Because it seems deeply contradictory in the sources.
Contradictory is the perfect word for it. On one hand, it was a brutal, unforgiving colonial occupation. The Japanese military decided they were going to do what the king never could. They were going to conquer the mountains.
By force.
Brutal force. They waged a ruthless pacification campaign against the indigenous tribes. We are talking about the use of modern artillery, electrified fences. And by the 1930s, they were even dropping poison gas from airplanes onto indigenous villages.
Just to secure access to resources.
Exactly, things like lucrative camphor wood.
That is horrific. But the sources also detail a completely different side of the occupation, especially down in the cities.
Yes, there's a paradox here.
Yep.
Japan wanted to prove to the Western powers that it was a modern, civilized empire capable of managing a model colony.
So they poured money into it.
Massive capital. While they were subjugating the mountains, they were building the Western plains. They built thousands of miles of modern railways, paved roads, and hydroelectric dams.
They modernized it.
Completely. They established a rigorous public score system, basically eradicating illiteracy. They built modern hospitals and wiped out the malaria and cholera that had plagued the island for centuries.
So they brought a level of bureaucratic efficiency, law and order, and public health that Taiwan had never seen under the king.
Exactly. So you have this bizarre dichotomy. It's an oppressive police state, but it's also a period of rapid modernization.
And the profound psychological result of this 50-year period is that the people living on Taiwan, both the descendants of early Chinese settlers and the indigenous groups, started to develop a unique, cohesive identity.
A completely separate identity. And that separation is the key to everything.
Because of what was happening on the mainland.
Right. While Taiwan was experiencing this intensely organized, Japanese-led modernization, what was happening on the Chinese mainland, the Qing dynasty totally collapses in 1911.
Right. Total chaos.
The mainland descends into a bloody warlord era, followed by a horrific civil war between the nationalists and the communists, and then the devastating Japanese invasion of the mainland in the 1930s.
So the two populations were existing on completely different historical and developmental tracks for half a century.
Completely different realities.
So when World War II finally ends in 1945 and Japan surrenders, Taiwan is stripped from Japan and handed over to the Republic of China.
which is governed by Chiang Kai-shek and his Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, or KMT.
You would think, based on the rhetoric we hear today from Beijing, that this would be a joyous family reunion.
It was the exact opposite. It was an immediate, catastrophic culture clash.
How so?
While the Taiwanese population had been educated in Japanese, they were accustomed to a highly structured, industrialized society and the rule of law.
And the KMT.
Suddenly, the arriving nationalist troops step off the boats, and to the Taiwanese, they looked completely backwards.
The sources described KMT troops who had never even seen modern plumbing.
Right. They were looting infrastructure. Deeply corrupt officials were dismantling Taiwanese factories and shipping the machinery back to the mainland to fight the communists.
There is a devastating local phrase from that 1945 handover period. The Taiwanese locals whispered to each other, "Dogs go and pigs come."
It's a brutal assessment of the situation.
Yeah. The Japanese were the dogs. They barked, they bit, they were fiercely oppressive, but they guarded the house and kept it clean.
And the incoming KMT forces were viewed as pigs. They just came to eat, sleep, and loot.
And that tension explodes into violence. But the dynamic changes permanently in 1949.
Because Chiang Kai-shek outright loses the Chinese Civil War.
Right. He loses to Mao Zedong's communists. The People's Republic of China is founded in Beijing, and Chiang, facing total annihilation, flees across the strait to Taiwan.
And he doesn't just bring his government. He brings an entire displaced society.
The logistics of that retreat are staggering. 2 million loyalists, soldiers, bureaucrats, and elites fled across the water in a matter of months.
It's a massive influx.
They washed ashore on an island that already had a population of about 6 million native Taiwanese. And Chiang didn't arrive as a guest seeking asylum.
No, he arrived as a dictator intent on absolute domination.
They imposed martial law, which ended up lasting for 38 years.
One of the longest periods of martial law in human history.
It was an era known as the White Terror. I want to emphasize what this looked like on the ground for you. The native Taiwanese, the people whose ancestors had been there through the Dutch, the King, and the Japanese, were systematically suppressed by this newly arrived mainlander elite.
The KMT shut the native Taiwanese out of the highest levels of government and the military. They banned the use of Japanese and local Taiwanese dialects in schools and media.
Violently enforcing Mandarin as the only acceptable language.
Exactly. Thousands of local intellectuals, doctors, and community leaders who pushed back were arrested, tortured, or simply disappeared by the secret police.
And Chiang Kai-shek maintained this incredibly rigid fiction that his regime in Taipei was the legitimate government of all of China.
Right, that they were just temporarily headquartered on Taiwan until they could recapture the mainland.
But as the decades dragged on through the Cold War, that dream of retaking the mainland became an obvious fantasy.
Delusional, really.
Yeah, and while the political system was frozen in authoritarianism, the Taiwanese economy went into hyperdrive.
Taiwan transformed into one of the Asian tigers, an absolute industrial and export powerhouse.
The economic miracle created a massive, highly educated middle class, and eventually, an educated middle class demands political representation.
They always do. Following Chiang Kai-shek's death and the gradual lifting of martial law in the late 80s, Taiwan underwent an almost unprecedented political miracle.
They pivoted from a brutal military dictatorship to a vibrant, multi-party democracy without a civil war.
It's incredible. And the climax of this transformation, according to the sources, happens in 1996.
Taiwan holds its first direct, free presidential election.
And the sheer historical weight of that is stunning. It wasn't just a milestone for Taiwan.
Right. It was the first time in the entire 4,000-year recorded history of Chinese society that a national leader was freely elected by a democratic vote.
That 1996 election shattered the old KMT fiction. It unleashed a massive wave of cultural self-awareness. The people of Taiwan finally had a voice to articulate who they actually were.
And when you look at the public opinion polling in our sources, which has been tracked meticulously for decades, the trend line is definitive.
Oh, it's a straight line.
Today, the vast, vast majority of the population does not identify as Chinese. They identify distinctly and proudly as Taiwanese.
If you are a 25-year-old software engineer living in Taipei today, your identity isn't rooted in some ancient dynasty in Beijing.
It's rooted in that complex geological core sample we talked about.
Exactly. Your identity is a synthesis of indigenous heritage, Japanese-built infrastructure, the trauma of KMT authoritarianism, and the hard-won freedom of a progressive democracy.
You have your own passport, your own military, your own currency, and your own elected president. You are, for all practical purposes, living in an independent country.
Which is the fundamental paradox of this entire geopolitical crisis.
Right.
Taiwan has moved on. It has crystallized into a distinct, self-governing, democratic entity.
But, and this is the pivot we have to make to understand the threat, Beijing is looking at this exact same island through a completely different lens. If the Taiwanese are looking at the present, Beijing is looking at the past.
Always the past.
And to understand why reunification is completely unconditionally non-negotiable for the Chinese Communist Party, we have to stop looking at Taiwan's democratic evolution, and we have to look deeply into China's historical trauma.
To understand the mindset of the CCP leadership, you must understand a concept known as the century of humiliation.
Right.
This is not just a chapter in a history textbook for them. It is the foundational myth, the absolute core legitimacy of the modern Chinese state.
What exactly are the mechanics of that humiliation? Because we throw that term around in the West, but what does it mean to build a national identity on a grievance?
It refers to the period roughly from the First Opium War in 1839 through to the end of World War II in 1945.
Okay.
For millennia, China viewed itself as the Middle Kingdom, the center of human civilization, economically and culturally superior to the rest of the world.
And then the British showed up.
But in the 19th century, the British Empire arrived with industrialized gunboats and fundamentally shattered that worldview. The British essentially fought a war to force the Qing dynasty to allow the importation of opium.
Devastating the Chinese population with addiction just to balance a trade deficit.
Exactly. And once the British cracked the door open, every other empire rushed in.
For the next century, the great Chinese empire was systematically picked apart.
The British, the French, the Russians, the Germans, and eventually the Japanese. They all forced China to sign what are known as the unequal treaties.
They carved out concession zones in Chinese cities where foreign law applied, not Chinese law.
They took control of Chinese ports and tariffs. They stripped away massive tracts of territory. The country descended into grinding poverty, famine, and warlordism.
The phrase that the sources highlight, which is drilled into every Chinese student today, is Wu Wang Guoqi.
It translates to, never forget our national humiliation.
I was trying to conceptualize how powerful that is. Imagine if the entire modern American identity wasn't built on the triumph of the Revolution or the Constitution, but was singularly focused on avenging the burning of Washington in 1812.
Amplified by 100 years of foreign occupation.
It's a patriotic demand for historical payback.
It is a demand for the restoration of natural order. And this is where the Chinese Communist Party draws its mandate to rule.
It's their social contract.
The implicit contract the CCP has with the Chinese populace is this. We are the ones who finally ended the century of humiliation. We expelled the foreigners. Under our rule, China has stood up and we will never, ever be bullied again.
But to fulfill that contract, you have to actually fix the map. You have to put the borders back to where they were before the foreigners arrived.
Precisely. And the CCP has been systematically checking those boxes. They reclaimed Tibet in 1951. They negotiated the return of Hong Kong from the British in 1997.
They got Macau back from the Portuguese in '99.
They have been relentlessly erasing the physical scars of those unequal treaties.
But Taiwan is the glaring, profound exception. Remember, the Qing dynasty ceded Taiwan to Japan in 1895 as part of an unequal treaty after a humiliating military defeat.
So for Beijing, the fact that Taiwan is still separate, still functioning outside of their control, and essentially acting as a military partner to the United States.
It means the century of humiliation isn't actually over.
It is an open, bleeding wound on the national psyche.
And that brings us to the current leader, Xi Jinping, and his grand vision, which he calls the China dream of national rejuvenation.
When we hear national rejuvenation in the West, we tend to think of economic metrics. Building more high-speed rail, increasing GDP, dominating green energy.
But the sources make it clear that for Xi, this is a sacred, almost spiritual, historical mission.
Economic power is just the tool. National rejuvenation is the goal. And Xi has stated explicitly that national rejuvenation cannot be achieved while Taiwan remains separate.
Bringing the island back under Beijing's control isn't merely a strategic land grab for a better defensive perimeter.
It is the absolute prerequisite for making the Chinese nation whole again.
And the sources point out that Xi Jinping operates with a different psychology than his predecessors. I was fascinated by the analysis from the late Lee Kuan Yew, the founding father of Singapore.
Li was one of the most astute geopolitical observers of the 20th century.
And he knew all the Chinese leaders intimately. He drew a fascinating comparison between Xi Jinping and Nelson Mandela.
Obviously not in their political philosophies, but in their emotional architecture.
Right. Lee Kuan Yew said that Xi Jinping has iron in his soul.
Iron in his soul.
Xi survived the horrific trauma of the Cultural Revolution. He was sent away to do hard labor in the countryside as a teenager. He learned to look past the superficial trappings of politics, past the applause, the red carpets, the flattering speeches.
And understand the raw, visceral, mechanical levers of power? He doesn't bluff.
And Xi wants political immortality. He wants to achieve the one monumental victory that even Mao Zedong could not achieve, the final, complete reunification of the motherland.
And he has introduced a terrifying sense of urgency by tying this mission to specific timetables.
The deadlines are what really elevate the tension here. The sources highlight two massive impending dates. First, Xi has ordered the People's Liberation Army to be fully modernized and capable of executing a successful invasion of Taiwan by the year 2027.
In 2027 isn't an arbitrary number. It marks the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Liberation Army.
But the ultimate unyielding deadline is 2049.
That is the centenary of the founding of the People's Republic of China.
Xi has made it clear that the Taiwan issue cannot be passed down from generation to generation forever. By 2049, the century of humiliation must be decisively, permanently closed.
I think we really need to try and wrap our heads around the gravity of this. We in the West often analyze international relations through the lens of policy disputes, tariffs, trade deals, climate accords.
Things that can be negotiated, compromised on, or kicked down the road.
But what our sources are screaming is that for Beijing, Taiwan is not a policy dispute. It is existential.
It is the ultimate test of the Communist Party's right to govern. To ask the CCP to formally accept Taiwanese independence is to ask them to permanently accept the legacy of the unequal treaties.
It would fundamentally fracture their legitimacy.
So, as we evaluate these sources, you have to ask yourself, can a rising, immensely proud superpower, led by a man with iron in his soul, possessing the largest navy in the world, simply accept permanent separation from a territory it considers its own flesh and blood?
Mathematically, psychologically, it seems impossible for them to back down.
That is the immense geopolitical gravity pulling from Beijing. But if we metaphorically spin the globe and look at this exact same island of Taiwan from the perspective of Washington, D.C., the gravity is just as intense.
And crucially, it has absolutely nothing to do with Chinese historical trauma.
This is where the narrative shifts. For the United States, Taiwan isn't about the past. It is entirely about the present, the future, and the survival of the American-led global order.
Why is Taiwan fundamentally non-negotiable for the United States? It begins with physical geography.
Okay, lay it out for us.
To understand American military strategy in the Indo-Pacific, you have to look at a concept known as the First Island Chain.
What exactly is that? If you look at a map, what are we seeing?
The First Island Chain is a string of major archipelagos that run parallel to the East Asian mainland. It acts like a massive wall in the ocean.
A wall.
Yeah, it starts up north in Japan, runs south through the Ryukyu Islands and Okinawa, hits Taiwan right in the middle, and then continues south of the Philippines and down into the Indonesian archipelago.
The historian Jonathan Manthorpe has a great visual description. He says Taiwan is the period dot at the base of the question mark formed by the Japanese islands.
If you are China, that island chain is a geographic prison. You are hemmed in.
But I didn't fully grasp how much of a prison it was until I read about the submarine geography. This was one of the most surprising, deeply mechanical facts in the sources.
The oceanography is the hidden key to this entire conflict. The waters immediately off the coast of mainland China, the East China Sea and the Taiwan Strait are incredibly shallow.
How shallow?
We are talking about an average depth of roughly 330 feet, maybe dropping to 1,500 feet in some areas.
Which doesn't sound that shallow until you realize what that means for a nuclear submarine. How do you actually track a submarine?
You track them primarily with acoustic sensors sonar. In shallow, constrained waters, sound bounces around, but more importantly, there isn't enough depth for a submarine to hide beneath what are called thermoclines.
Thermoclines. Those are layers of water with rapidly changing temperatures that can bend and distort sonar waves, right?
Exactly. In 330 feet of water, a 300-foot-long nuclear submarine is essentially operating in a bathtub.
They are highly vulnerable to being detected by acoustic sensors on the seafloor, magnetic anomaly detectors on maritime patrol aircraft, and anti-submarine helicopters.
So if a Chinese nuclear ballistic missile submarine wants to leave its port on the mainland and enter the open, untrackable expanse of the Pacific Ocean to establish a nuclear deterrent patrol,
It has to navigate through this shallow bathtub.
and then squeeze through the narrow, shallow choke points of the first island chain straits that are heavily monitored by the U.S. Navy and its allies.
But if China controls Taiwan, that entire strategic calculus flips overnight.
Because immediately off the eastern coast of Taiwan, the continental shelf doesn't slope gently. It drops off a cliff.
The ocean floor plunges down to 13,000 feet deep almost instantly.
I see. If China annexes Taiwan and builds a submarine base on the deep-water east coast, those nuclear submarines can leave port and immediately vanish into the deep, dark abyss of the Pacific Ocean.
They could roam unhindered. They could easily sail to the west coast of the United States.
It would give China the unmitigated ability to project massive naval and nuclear power across the Pacific, directly threatening U.S. bases in Guam, Hawaii, and ultimately the American mainland.
It fundamentally destroys the defensive line the U.S. relies on.
This isn't a new revelation either. The sources quote General Douglas MacArthur way back in 1950, at the start of the Cold War.
He famously described Taiwan as an unsinkable aircraft carrier and submarine tender.
MacArthur understood the mechanics of the map. If a hostile power controls that unsinkable aircraft carrier in the center of the chain, American dominance in the Pacific is physically broken.
So the geographic reality is dire, but the sources point to a psychological reality for the United States that is arguably even more devastating: the total collapse of alliance credibility.
Let's walk through that nightmare scenario.
Okay, let's say China decides to launch an invasion of Taiwan, and the United States president looks at the war games, looks at the potential for mass casualties, looks at the risk of a nuclear exchange, and decides it's too costly. We aren't going to send American sons and daughters to die for an island 6,000 miles away.
The U.S. stands down. Taiwan falls.
What is the immediate mechanical consequence of that decision globally?
The sources are unequivocal about this. It would be viewed instantly as America's Munich moment.
A direct reference to the 1938 appeasement of Nazi Germany.
Are the Allies allowed Hitler to carve up Czechoslovakia to avoid war? For over 70 years, the United States has armed Taiwan, supported its democracy, and provided a heavily implied security guarantee.
If America simply walks away and allows a thriving democracy of 23 million people to be crushed by an authoritarian superpower, the shockwaves would vaporize American power overnight.
Put yourself in the position of the Prime Minister of Japan or the President of South Korea. Your entire national defense strategy is predicated on the United States nuclear umbrella.
You allow U.S. bases on your soil because Washington has promised to protect you if things go bad.
If you watch America abandon Taiwan, an island that is literally 70 miles away from Japanese territory, what is your immediate conclusion?
Your conclusion is that the American promise is worthless. If they won't risk Los Angeles to save Taipei, they certainly won't risk Los Angeles to save Tokyo or Seoul.
The credibility of U.S. defense treaties would evaporate.
So what do those allied nations do the next morning?
They would have only two logical survival-based choices. Option 1. They rapidly develop their own nuclear weapons to deter China themselves, which triggers a massive, highly destabilizing regional arms race in Asia.
And option 2?
Option 2. They realize China is the new undisputed hegemon of the region, and they immediately seek strategic accommodation with Beijing.
They kick the U.S. military out of their countries, align their foreign policy with Chinese interests, and bow to the new power center.
The sources state it with chilling clarity. Abandoning Taiwan wouldn't just be the loss of an island, it would signal the definitive, undeniable end of the American century.
The U.S. would be forcefully pushed out of the Indo-Pacific, which is the undeniable economic center of gravity for the entire 21st century.
It would completely rewrite the global order.
I want to use an analogy to synthesize these massive geopolitical forces. If China sees Taiwan as the missing piece of its national soul, the United States sees Taiwan as the cork in the bottle of the Pacific.
If that cork pops, all of American dominance, all of its alliances, its freedom of navigation, and its leverage in Asia just spill out and evaporate.
That perfectly encapsulates the stakes. You have two superpowers whose core interests are mutually exclusive, locked onto a single point on the map.
But its historical destiny, geographic choke points, and global hegemony weren't enough to trigger World War III, there is a third, intensely modern layer to this conflict.
And it is a layer that sits in the pocket of whoever is listening to this right now. We have to talk about the digital
The
universe.
semiconductors.
Yes. We live in a world that feels like magic generative artificial intelligence, instantaneous streaming video, autonomous electric vehicles, reusable rockets.
But at its absolute most basic, microscopic level, the entire modern digital world is just an endless sea of millions and billions of ones and zeros.
And those ones and zeros are actually just expressions of electrical currents flipping tiny microscopic switches on and off.
Those microscopic switches are called transistors, and those transistors are housed on computer chips, also known as semiconductors.
I was reading the analysis by Chris Miller, the author of Chip War, and he makes a brilliant comparative point. He says that chips are the steel and aluminum of the 21st century.
During World War II, a nation's power was measured in its heavy industrial capacity. How many tons of steel you could pour to build tanks and battleships.
Today, a nation's power is measured in its computing power. Chips run absolutely everything.
They are the foundational architecture of modern civilization. They run the data centers, powering the global internet, the cell towers routing our communications, the algorithms driving financial markets, and crucially, the advanced precision strike missiles, stealth fighters, and sensor networks that define modern military supremacy.
If you cannot process data faster than your enemy, you lose.
And here is the jaw-dropping, almost absurd reality of the global economy. The vast, overwhelming majority of the world's most advanced, cutting-edge chips are manufactured on this one small, earthquake-prone, typhoon-battered island, Taiwan.
Specifically by a single behemoth company called TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company.
It was founded in the 1980s by a visionary engineer named Morris Chang, who pioneered a completely new business model called the foundry model.
How does that model work mechanically? Because it explains why Taiwan has such a stranglehold on the industry.
Think of it like a bespoke, ultra-high-tech bakery. Before Morris Chang, companies like Intel designed their own chips and baked them in their own factories.
Chang realized that as chips got smaller and more complex, building the factories would become insanely expensive.
So TSMC said, we won't design any chips. You, Apple, NVIDIA, Qualcomm, you design the brilliant recipes, we will just focus 100% of our energy on being the absolute best in the world at baking the bread.
And they succeeded beyond comprehension. I want to explain the manufacturing process to really drive home how difficult it is to bake this bread, because people often ask, why can't the US or China just build their own factories tomorrow?
The manufacturing of an advanced microchip is arguably the most complex physical process human beings have ever engineered.
The sources detail the process of extreme ultraviolet lithography, or EUV,
Right, the ASML machines.
to carve these microscopic transistors, which are now literally the size of a few atoms, smaller than a virus. TSMC uses machines built by a Dutch company called ASML.
And these machines fire a high-power laser at microscopic droplets of molten tin falling in a vacuum,
The laser hits the tin droplet 50,000 times a second.
vaporizing it into a plasma that emits extreme ultraviolet light.
That light is bounced off perfectly flawless mirrors to carve the circuit patterns into a silicon wafer.
And this all has to happen in clean rooms that are thousands of times purer than a hospital operating theater. A single speck of dust can ruin millions of dollars of product.
It requires ultra-pure chemicals, perfectly stable electricity, and decades of institutional knowledge.
You can't just throw billions of dollars at a wall and replicate TSMC. The process is too precise, the supply chain too entrenched.
Which brings us to the profound vulnerability of China. The sources provide a statistic that is hard to process. China, the factory of the world, spends more money every single year importing computer chips than it spends on importing oil.
Let that sink in. China's entire modern economy, their vast manufacturing base, their aspirations to dominate artificial intelligence, and their massive military modernization program are all fatally dependent on microscopic pieces of silicon that they physically cannot produce themselves at the highest levels of sophistication.
They must buy them, largely from Taiwan.
And that dependency is exactly what the United States weaponized with the entity list in our opening hook with Huawei. Washington proved that it could sever a Chinese tech giant's access to TSMC's advanced chips without firing a single bullet. What's fascinating here is the concept of the silicon shield.
Right. The theory goes like this. Because the entire global economy, including China's economy, relies so heavily on TSMC's factories, those factories act as an impenetrable shield for Taiwan.
The logic is that China wouldn't dare invade or bomb Taiwan because a war would physically destroy the very chip fabrication plants that China needs to survive. The economic blowback would be instantaneous, mutual assured destruction.
That is the optimistic view, but the sources present a terrifying counterargument. The silicon bullseye. Does Taiwan's monopoly on advanced chips actually protect it, or does it make Taiwan the ultimate irresistible target?
Look at it from Xi Jinping's perspective. You just watched your greatest geopolitical rival, the United States, technologically asphyxiate your top companies on a whim.
Doesn't seizing the physical source of those chips become a matter of supreme existential national security?
If whoever controls those microscopic factories controls the future of human technology, AI, and military supremacy, then capturing TSMC intact might be worth almost any price.
It creates an incredibly volatile paradox. I was looking at my smartphone while reading these economic reports. A standard modern smartphone requires over a dozen different highly specialized chips to function. The main processor, the cellular modem, the Bluetooth transceiver, the image signal processor for the camera.
Now extrapolate that single phone to the entire global economy. Medical equipment, power grids, commercial aviation, banking systems.
Trillions and trillions of dollars of global GDP are entirely tethered to a few highly sensitive, microscopic factories sitting right on top of one of the most active, heavily armed geopolitical fault lines in human history.
It is a precariousness that defies logic.
So we have the immense weight of historical destiny driving Beijing, the absolute necessity of global hegemony and alliance credibility anchoring Washington, and the entire digital future of human civilization sitting in clean rooms on an island of 23 million people. The stakes literally could not be higher.
So let's stop theorizing. Let's look at the war games.
What happens if the fuse is actually lit? What would a war over Taiwan physically look like?
The first thing the military analysts in our sources stress is that you have to completely throw away your Hollywood conceptions of warfare. This wouldn't look like D-Day.
A traditional amphibious beach storming is incredibly unlikely to be the opening move, simply because the mechanics of crossing the Taiwan Strait are a nightmare.
I was reading about the geography of the strait. It's roughly 100 miles wide, but it is notoriously turbulent.
The weather is terrible for most of the year, with typhoons in the summer and massive swells in the winter.
And even if you manage to get an invasion fleet across, Taiwan doesn't have endless, flat, sandy beaches. It has high cliffs, urban sprawl, and only a handful of beaches suitable for landing heavy armor, all of which have been heavily fortified by the Taiwanese military for 70 years.
It's essentially a fortress. So rather than throwing hundreds of thousands of troops into a meat grinder on the beaches, the wargaming scenarios outline a spectrum of other military and paramilitary tactics China could use.
What are the options on the table?
At the lower end of the escalation ladder, China could try organizing domestic insurrection or massive disinformation campaigns within Taiwan to collapse the government from within.
However, given the deep-seated animosity toward the CCP among the Taiwanese public, the sources view this as highly unlikely to succeed.
The Taiwanese aren't going to rise up and welcome the People's Liberation Army. What's the next step up?
Cyber warfare. China could launch massive, coordinated cyber attacks designed to completely paralyze Taiwan's civilian and military infrastructure.
They could attempt to take down the power grid, blind the radar stations, sever the undersea internet cables, and freeze the banking systems, throwing the island into total chaos before a single shot is fired.
And militarily, they could do something short of a full invasion to test the waters. The sources mention the offshore islands.
Yes. Taiwan controls several small islands like Kinmen and Matsu that sit just a couple of miles off the coast of mainland China.
You can literally see them from the Chinese city of Xiamen.
The PLA could launch a lightning strike to seize one of those islands. It would be a bloody, violent warning, a way of saying, we are willing to bleed for this, and essentially trying to force Taipei to the negotiating table in terror while daring the United States to start World War III over a tiny speck of rock.
But the scenario that the military strategists seem most terrified of, because it's the hardest to counter, is a suffocating economic blockade.
A blockade is highly probable because it utilizes China's massive maritime advantage without immediately risking an amphibious slaughter.
Using their vast navy, their massive coast guard, and their maritime militia, China could simply draw a ring of ships around the island.
They would declare the waters a live-fire quarantine zone and state that nothing goes in or out without Beijing's express permission.
Let's walk through the mechanics of starving an island. Taiwan is an export powerhouse, but it is deeply vulnerable on imports. They import nearly 98% of their energy, natural gas, coal, oil.
They import the vast majority of their food. If you ring the island with destroyers and submarines, commercial shipping stops instantly.
No global shipping company is going to send a massive liquid natural gas tanker into a war zone where their insurance premiums just went up 10,000%.
Exactly. The power plants run out of fuel in a matter of weeks. The factories shut down. The food rationing begins. A blockade would be a brutal attempt to strangle the island into submission, forcing the Taiwanese to capitulate without triggering the massive casualties of a beach invasion.
But let's say deterrence completely fails. Let's say Beijing calculates that a blockade gives the U.S. too much time to respond, and they opt for the massive, overwhelming missile strike, followed by a full-scale airborne and amphibious invasion.
And let's say, against the odds, they manage to get 1 million troops ashore and take control of Taipei. The war is over, right?
No, that is when the true nightmare begins for China. The sources paint a grim picture of what an occupation would actually entail.
Taiwan isn't a flat plain where you can easily roll tanks. It's a densely populated urban sprawl backed against massive, rugged, jungle-covered mountain ranges.
And you are dealing with 23 million people who have lived in a free society, who possess sophisticated technical skills, and who have generational trauma associated with being oppressed by mainlanders.
The resistance would be horrific.
An occupation will require a massive, violent, ongoing military presence, facing constant urban guerrilla warfare and sabotage.
The sources note that pacifying Taiwan would make the severe, systemic crackdowns we've seen in Xinjiang and Tibet look peaceful by comparison.
It would become a gaping, bleeding, unhealable wound for China, draining their military resources and completely destroying whatever moral authority or economic integration they have in the international community.
And the global fallout from the shooting starting. We've talked about the Silicon Shield. If missiles start hitting Taiwan or a blockade cuts off the supply routes, those TSMC chip factories go offline instantly.
Even if they aren't bombed, a clean room can't operate without stable electricity and a constant supply of ultra-pure imported chemicals.
If TSMC stops shipping chips, the global supply chain goes into cardiac arrest. The sources estimate that trillions of dollars would vanish from the global economy almost immediately.
Car manufacturing plants in Germany and Detroit would halt. Electronics assembly in Southeast Asia would freeze. The economic devastation would rival the Great Depression, impacting every nation on Earth.
Furthermore, a war over Taiwan wouldn't be isolated to just China and Taiwan. If the U.S. decides to intervene to save the first island chain, it would draw in a vast multinational coalition.
You would have American carrier strike groups, Japanese destroyers, Australian submarines, and British warships, all rushing into the relatively small, highly contested shallow waters of the East and South China Seas.
It would be the most concentrated naval buildup since World War II. The sea lanes would be choked with vessels, nuclear submarines, and hypersonic anti-ship missiles.
When you have two heavily armed nuclear superpowers operating in that close proximity, the risk of a miscalculation, a pilot getting trigger-happy, a radar glitch causing a rapid escalation into a nuclear exchange is terrifyingly high.
So we arrive at the grim conclusion of these war games. War is the ultimate worst-case scenario. It guarantees mutual economic destruction, millions of casualties, and the risk of global holocaust.
But, and this is the brutal reality of great power politics, the sources make a crucial point. For the United States, China simply seizing Taiwan without an American intervention is a secondary worst-case scenario.
Because as we established, that collapses the American-led global order and cedes the 21st century to an authoritarian superpower.
So the world is caught between two catastrophic, world-altering outcomes.
Which begs the most important question of all. How in the world have we avoided this apocalyptic scenario for the last 70 years? Since Chiang Kai-shek fled to the island in 1949, how have we kept the peace across the Taiwan Strait when the forces pushing for conflict are so massive?
The answer to that is perhaps the most bizarre, brilliant, and high-stakes psychological game in modern diplomatic history. It is a concept known as strategic ambiguity.
I want to spend time on this because it sounds like a contradiction. Usually in military alliances, clarity is what deters war. Article 5 of NATO is very clear. You attack one of us, you fight all of us.
But with Taiwan, the U.S. chose the exact opposite path.
They chose deliberate obscurity. The architecture of this ambiguity was laid down in 1979.
The U.S., seeking to pull China away from the Soviet Union during the Cold War, made the momentous decision to officially normalize diplomatic relations with Beijing.
To do that, the U.S. had to formally recognize the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China, and they had to cut official diplomatic ties with Taipei. They closed the embassy and pulled the troops out.
But the U.S. Congress, not wanting to completely throw Taiwan to the wolves, immediately passed a law called the Taiwan Relations Act. And reading this act is like reading a masterpiece of deliberate doublespeak.
It is brilliantly non-committal. The act says that the United States will supply Taiwan with arms of a defensive character.
It also states that the U.S. will consider any non-peaceful attempt to determine the future of Taiwan as a matter of grave concern to the United States.
But it stops deliberately, agonizingly short of a concrete, ironclad mutual defense treaty. It does not explicitly say if the People's Liberation Army attacks Taiwan, the United States military will directly intervene and sink Chinese ships.
And that ambiguity was a feature, not a bug. It created a system of dual deterrence. For decades, it worked flawlessly. On one side, it kept Beijing guessing.
The Chinese leadership had to calculate. If we launch an invasion, will the American aircraft carriers show up? We can't be sure, and fighting the U.S. Navy is a risk we cannot afford to take.
So it deterred an unprovoked invasion.
And on the other side, it kept Taipei guessing. The Taiwanese politicians had to calculate. If we formally declare independence, change our constitution, and enrage China into attacking us, will the Americans bail us out? We can't be sure. They might say we provoked it and leave us to die.
So it deterred a unilateral declaration of independence.
It was a perfect equilibrium of uncertainty. The status quo was maintained because nobody wanted to find out what the U.S. would actually do.
But over the years, maintaining that perfect balance has proven incredibly difficult. U.S. presidents have constantly muddled the message, leaning too far one way or the other. You look at the history and the sources.
In the 1990s, Bill Clinton sent aircraft carriers through the strait, but also publicly stated the U.S. didn't support Taiwanese independence.
George W. Bush was asked on television what he would do if Taiwan was attacked, and he blurted out that he would do whatever it takes to help Taiwan defend itself. Obama tried to maintain a quiet pivot to Asia.
And most recently, the ambiguity has been stretched to its absolute breaking point. President Biden has been asked point-blank by journalists on multiple occasions if U.S. forces, American men and women, would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese attack.
And multiple times he has explicitly answered, yes.
Now, the White House staff always immediately rushes to walk those comments back, issuing statements claiming the policy of strategic ambiguity hasn't changed. But the signal is sent.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, a massive problem emerges. The entire logic of deterrence only works if the threat is credible.
That is the crux of the current crisis. In the 1990s, when Clinton sent the carriers, the U.S. military was so vastly superior to China's that the ambiguity leaned heavily toward deterrence. China literally couldn't track the carriers, let alone sink them.
But today, the balance of power has fundamentally shifted. China's military has modernized at a staggering, unprecedented pace. They have built the largest navy in the world by hull count.
Crucially, they have developed an entire arsenal of highly advanced hypersonic carrier-killer missiles designed specifically to push the U.S. Navy thousands of miles away from the Chinese coast.
Which brings us to the ultimate intellectual climax of this entire deep dive, the question that keeps geopolitical strategists awake at night. Does peace survive because nobody knows exactly what America would do? Or does that uncertainty now invite a devastating miscalculation?
That is the most dangerous question in the world right now. If Xi Jinping looks at the United States, a country exhausted by 2 decades of counterinsurgency wars in the Middle East, a country dealing with profound internal political division and economic debt, and assumes that the American public simply will not tolerate a nuclear war over an island 6,000 miles away, then strategic ambiguity might be the exact thing that triggers the war.
He might calculate that the U.S. is bluffing, and he might miscalculate.
I am struck by the historical parallel here. It is the ultimate Berlin in the Cold War dance all over again. During the Cold War, West Berlin was this vibrant, democratic bastion of the Western Alliance, completely surrounded deep inside hostile Soviet territory.
Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, they all had to figure out how to protect Berlin, how to supply it, how to stand up to the Soviets without accidentally provoking a global nuclear holocaust over a single city.
And now, the United States and its allies have to execute that exact same incredibly dangerous diplomatic dance with Taiwan. But the stakes are arguably even higher now because West Berlin didn't manufacture the microscopic lifeblood of the global economy.
The margin for error is virtually zero. Misread a signal, cross an invisible red line, or launch a missile on a faulty radar reading, and the consequences cascade globally in a matter of hours.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's bring this narrative full circle. When you hear the word Taiwan on the news, when you see a headline about a military exercise or a trade tariff, we want you to see past the simplistic rhetoric.
Taiwan is not just an island. It is the focal point where the deeply emotional, trauma-forged history of Chinese identity crashes violently into the immense, unyielding weight of American global credibility.
And sitting right at the epicenter of that crash are the microscopic chips that run modern civilization.
It is a convergence of historical, military, and economic forces unlike anything else on the geopolitical map.
But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. We spend all our time in these deep dives, obsessing over the hardware of a potential war. We wargame the ships, the hypersonic missiles, the sonar arrays, the 11.8 billion transistors sitting on a single piece of silicon.
But what if the ultimate trigger for this conflict isn't military or technological at all? What if the trigger is demographic?
Demographics are destiny. It is the one force you cannot negotiate with.
Look at the people of Taiwan today. The older generations, the ones who fled with Chiang Kai-shek in 1949, the ones who were educated on the mainland and still held some distant psychological, cultural, or familial connection to the idea of a unified China, they are passing away.
They are being replaced by a purely 100% native Taiwanese youth generation, a generation that has only ever known a vibrant democracy, that has never lived a single day under CCP rule, and that possesses zero psychological connection to the mainland.
The polling reflects this shift dramatically. The desire for unification among the Taiwanese youth is shrinking to statistical insignificance. The idea of voluntarily giving up their democracy to be ruled by Beijing is unthinkable to them.
So, as that generational shift completes itself, the window for Beijing to achieve a peaceful reunification, mathematically and permanently, closes. The people of Taiwan will simply never vote to join the mainland.
So here is the question you have to ask. Will that demographic ticking clock, the terrifying realization in Beijing that they have permanently lost the hearts and minds of the island and that time is running out, force a catastrophic military move, regardless of who has the most ships or the most chips?
Think about that demographic time bomb the next time you look at the smartphone in your hand.